Welcome to my Get Going, Then Get Good workshop with Jack Butcher. Jack is the founder of Visualize Value, and I'm the founder of Rite of Passage. And this is an idea that Jack and I have been talking about for a couple of years. First, how do you get started? Then, once you do get started, how do you actually listen to the world for feedback to get a sense on what's working, what's not working, and how, as a creator, you want to double down on the things that are resonating with an audience, so that you can go from getting going in order to then eventually get good. So this is a 90-minute presentation. Jack presents first, I present second, and then at the end we have some time for Q&A. Now I want to introduce the man of the day, Mr. Jack Butcher, who's wearing his Terry Black's barbecue hat, which is literally 5 minutes away from me in Austin. Jack, hello, man.
Good afternoon. How is everybody? So this is, obviously you guys are familiar with this statement here. It's the name of the webinar that we are currently occupying. And David and I have gone back and forth around this idea for a long time. I think there's similarities in both of our experiences, not only in valuing this statement, looking back retrospectively, but in the materials that David's built in Rite of Passage and I've built in Visualize Value. This is just such a core principle of what building reputation online comes down to, what attracting creative work opportunities comes down to. And what I would like to share today is something I've only haven't shared this publicly, only sort of behind closed door, very small Visualize Value client meetings. So hopefully it's an interesting look at the journey from practitioner to building a reputation for yourself and doing something really specific online. So to tee it off, I want to talk about this idea that, again, is very central to the business of building like a creative portfolio online. And for me, this was a huge, just having this mental model was a huge release of pressure. So the sawdust principle actually, I think, was coined in the context of somebody who ran a business selling wood. So you cut down trees, chop up wood, put it into 2x4s, whatever else. And there's this huge amount of product or like offcuts and sawdust that is produced as you refine these pieces of work and this product that you're selling to one market. And sawdust, I think, applies even more so in the context of doing creative work online. So the idea that there is an incredible amount of material that is produced from the act of producing something, and it's a simple tweak in how you think, but it can really arm you with a lot of assets that you can publish. So proof of work in the context of graphic design for me started 10, 11 years ago or so. And I think one of the reasons design led me down this path is because design has always been about proof of work. And I think a lot of professions are becoming about proof of work more than they may used to have been. So any interview you would attend as a designer, you have to show your portfolio. So nobody's really that bothered about the credentials on your CV. They just want to look at the work you've produced and make an assessment based on, the quality, the style, that, whether or not that's something that fits their aesthetic or their goals. So the idea that sawdust and portfolio building and proof of work was a huge part of all of the steps that I made in my career previously, before I became an entrepreneur, tried to do anything independently. So this is my CV as it stands. I worked in 6 different agencies up here. So Exit Creative, I started there in 2010. The 5 following jobs were sort of bouncing around those 9 months at a time and leveraging the work I did in each of those positions to get a, I don't know, 1% pay rise and a new job somewhere else, but ultimately ended up being the same sort of burnout cycle. And then the bottom row here, these are 3 different businesses that I built myself. The first being a creative agency that was, had no specialization whatsoever. The second being a slightly specialized creative agency, and the third being Visualized Value, which has a very specific focus and output. So get going, then get good. I think in the context of the thing you produce is true, but it's also true in the context of gathering experiences and kind of tweaking your approach in different situations. So it's not like you wake up one day and you have this eureka moment. It really is this grind of gathering experience from all these different places and slowly refining that into a place where you have a very specific thing to offer. So throughout my career, I got this. I had this. Even from university, you get into this muscle of just publishing your work. And this was before I was active on Twitter or any social platforms. This is like a designer to designer platform called Dribble. You may be familiar with it, but it's relatively, it's not really a social network. You just post images there, and it was kind of just a muscle developed as part of the creative process. No work came of it, no network building, nothing. So, but I was determined to continue to publish work here just as a way to walk into a job interview and say, here's the work I've produced. So over time, I started to discover the benefits of basically performing the same action, but on a network that has far more chance of reaching people that need what I was building. So I love this idea from Naval. It's not 10,000 hours that creates outliers, it's 10,000 iterations. And, if we map that back to the idea of getting going, that's, I think, a more precise way to talk about how people actually improve. It's not the amount of time you spend. You can, another way people reference this, I can't remember who said it originally, but the idea that if you stay in a job for 20 years, the majority of people don't have 20 years experience. They have 1 year of experience repeated 20 times. So this idea of putting yourself in different situations and exposing yourself to the need to iterate, to me, is it's not intuitive in the moment, but you kind of have to trust the idea that you'll eventually reach a place where all of these pieces kind of lock in place in hindsight. Another great Steve Jobs quote that we talked about in the last webinar David and I did is this idea of collecting dots. So Steve Jobs attended typography seminars, pulled computers apart as a kid. Dad was a carpenter, I believe, and the way he constructed cabinets made the back of the cabinet just as well finished as the front of the cabinet. And all of these different disparate experiences ended up in Apple and the products that Apple made. It wasn't waking up one day and thinking, I'm going to invent the iPhone. It has a lot to do with all of the situations he exposed himself to and trusting that following your curiosity is going to bring you this level of expertise that you can combine in new and interesting ways. So I just threw a few slides in here of all the variations of work that I was working on before Visualized Value was a thing. So commercial work for agencies, like building and designing digital products, applications, social media posts, all sorts of stuff, shooting commercials for car brands. And then as I started to find what I was uniquely good at, which was counterintuitive in the world of marketing and advertising, which is the presentations that you would use to win the work. So not the thing that the client was paying for, but the thing that you would use to convince the client to pay you. And those moments, I think I didn't pay attention to when I was producing the thing because it was counterintuitive in that environment. But in hindsight, you can really see that there is value in the things that most people don't want to do, and that was definitely the case with this. So I would invest far more time in this laborious, boring part of the process than the other designers, art directors, whoever else in my colleagues in whichever of those previous jobs I was referencing. And that just turned out to be the thing that helped me move from, being anything or everything to everyone, or just being a designer or creative person, to wrapping that up in this very specific value proposition, essentially, where it's like, if you have something complicated to explain, I can help you visualize it and explain it better to whoever you need to explain it to. While I was doing that, I was working on this other little agency business, which was essentially a productized podcast studio, which I think if you know visualized value work, if you see this navy blue in the bottom right down here, the experts unleashed, there's a little bit of the DNA of visualized value is kind of creeping into this work. So designer for hire, but starting to identify a bit of a style or this thing that I think I'm uniquely interested in. So I started to creep into other work, and I noticed the theme, and then eventually trusted it enough to just turn that into the thing. And because the internet is such a crazy exponential place, you can be that focused and produce and build a decent audience that way. Another way of saying 10,000 iterations or 10,000 reps here, it's like a fact of nature that your repeated stress and exposure to shock and different challenges results in growth. So I want to rewind it back because, might look like a highlight reel here, and the idea that, you're just laying golden eggs, but I can tell you that is 100% not the case. So I was writing a blog when I moved to New York in 2010. I don't think anybody has ever read this blog. I actually was looking for the URL before this meeting, and I can see it up in the URL bar there. But I was writing a blog to nobody. I was posting my thoughts to Twitter. For some reason, nobody was reading them. I don't think I had a network of people on there. But I started 10, 11 years ago publishing work, putting stuff out there. And this is another great highlight. When I first started my agency business, the only people that were commenting on my posts were my mom and her friends with completely irrelevant, nonsensical stuff. So they definitely didn't read what I was writing. They were just commenting on this picture of potatoes, which I was trying to be clever with. And even a couple of years ago, I was posting visualized value content to Facebook with literally zero reception, or in this case, friends and family are like, oh, Jack's doing this cute graphic design thing. It wasn't until I got into the world of Twitter and these networks that spread ideas in a very different way than a closed network like Facebook did, I see the potential of this thing. One more thing. How am I doing on time, by the way, David? I want to make sure I'm...
Keep rolling, man. This is great.
So this is another, I think, an interesting contrast. So I was of the mindset before I started using Twitter aggressively, I would say, that these people who were once my absolute idols, design heroes, this guy, Tobias Van Schneider, if you haven't seen his work, check it out. He's an incredibly talented dude and like a massive, massive inspiration of mine throughout my career. And I remember like just replying to his tweets. This is 5 years ago or something. And 5 years later, when I was doing my work in public, I had found the focus of visualized value. He hit me up and he's like, would you like to write an article on my blog, which was a blog that I'd read for 8 years going through design school and got a lot of my inspiration from. So those opportunities that arose as a result of literally doing the same thing I was doing, but doing it in an environment where somebody could eventually see it, led to all of these outcomes that obviously you could never predict. Another example, my wife is the only person that's reading my post back here in 2019 still. So there's definitely, there's kind of a combination of just sticking at it for an incredibly long time and eventually finding the formula. So I think there's, and there's no perfect way to explain this, but persistence to a degree is obviously an ingredient that's required, and then iteration, as we mentioned up above. And this is another personal milestone of mine. Naval, a huge influence. When I read that tweet thread on that's pinned on the top of this profile here, how to get rich without getting lucky, a lot of those ideas really helped me think about and execute on what visualized value is. And then, a year later, after taking all those principles and putting them into practice, was able to credit Naval for helping me figure this stuff out, essentially, even though we'd never spoken in person. And the sort of retweet or the implied, at least acknowledgement of the fact that those ideas had, I'd taken those ideas and executed on them was another milestone in my mind. So I tried to do some back of the envelope math here. So before visualized value, I was working 60 hours a week for 10 years, 31,000 hours. And since then, this is actually a little old, these stats, so it's probably up from here a little bit. Visualized value itself is 3,600 hours of focus, which is, 3,500 tweets, 1,000 graphics, 200 articles, working on 10 platforms. So built out from a Twitter feed to Instagram, Substack, Shopify, Mighty Networks, YouTube, built like very specific websites. But it wasn't until finding that thing that I expanded out into all of these different platforms. And again, just another plug for Twitter as probably something that could have cut my journey short by a few years at least, because I was publishing to these networks that essentially had closed. The way ideas spread around closed networks is very different than something like Twitter. And you could also attribute this to just how many more people are on Twitter now than were 5 years ago. But I do believe in like massively in the power of Twitter as a platform. I know that's a huge recommendation of David's as well. And writing is obviously an incredible skill to build your network on Twitter, but amazing what can happen in a year. And another thing I would say is, look, early on, I would get frustrated with the idea that, oh man, I can't overwhelm people with content. I can't be posting 20 times a day. I can't have an idea pop in my head and then just write it out. But that I would attribute that behavior of just being like relentlessly curious and publishing even to the point where you feel like this may be too much. It worked for me, and people that I hadn't spoken to in years and years and years would reach out and say, I just see your stuff everywhere at this point. And I didn't even know that they were, they were following the work or they were on platform X. And it's, there's just such a barrage of noise you're up against too. So the more effectively you can turn what you're doing into something that you can broadcast frequently, the more opportunity comes your way. And then I'll just end on this idea, which is, getting going, I think, is about collecting these spheres. So you stumble into all these different areas of interest throughout your career, books you read, places you go, people you meet. And I think holding these two ideas in your head separately is very difficult, but I think it's powerful that there is a certain, this phase of your life never stops, right? This attitude should never stop. The idea that you're still collecting experiences, but at a certain point, you get to a place where you can get aligned with a ton of those ideas start to layer on top of each other, and you can build something that represents that unique combination of ideas. And that's what visualized value became after 10, 11, 12, you could even say 32 years of sort of messing about and doing a bunch of different things and being exposed to different environments, people, places, problems. And one of the things I wanted to also get in here, there's not a slide to represent this, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with gathering that experience by joining networks that already exist. So I could attribute so much of my skill set to working in an agency environment where a different problem was thrown at me every single day, and I couldn't, pick and choose what I was working on. I was just told, hey, we've got to get this thing out the door, let's do it. And I think, there's so much value in just identifying what stage you're at and working on either gathering new experience or synthesizing, or a combination of the two. It's not this linear process that really, the most cliche advice, trust the process, the things will align, look backwards and line things up. But that's really what happened. And hopefully the slides above demonstrated some of that. And I believe that's my last slide.
I have a question for you. How do you think of all this, given your principle of make noise and listen for signal? You showed some of your earlier tweets that were getting no engagement, and the fact that you weren't succeeding. So I want to hear you talk about how you balance the listening to others, knowing when you're doing well as a creative, but also making sure that you're not listening to people so much that you're just some automaton who's just doing whatever the audience wants, and actually being able to orient yourself towards a brand that's as distinct as Visualize Value.
Yeah, good question. And one thing I think that wasn't in this particular presentation is the idea of, I haven't talked about this at all really, but the idea of service is where all of this comes from. So I think coming from we talked about this as well, David, it might even need another session to get like all the way through this idea. But I think there's two ways to approach it. There's the Morgan Housel, I just watched that video you sent over where it's write selfishly, do write for yourself, and people with your mentality will eventually show up and start reading what you're writing. I think that perspective comes from having figured out who you are and what you want to write about, which I think comes from providing a service of some kind, or trying to distill an idea, or being in an environment where you have to, agency and marketing environments are my experience. And if you ask me to figure out whether that, like, is that who I am? Like, if I was born 1,000 times, would I end up doing the same thing? Or is it like something that I found like intriguing enough to develop a skill set around? And it's more of the idea of solving someone's, maybe this is too specific of a way to put it, but I think helping someone figure something out, or writing something that helps a business owner better explain what they do, like that feeling to me is just as satisfying as writing something that I would have wanted to read myself. So I think it depends on an individual level what really fires you up. But what I identified, I think, as the thing that I am interested in is helping people communicate more effectively, whether that's like a person or a business, or and the agency environment sort of got me addicted to that solving of that problem. And where the like huge gap I think came from, and when I started to hone in on Visualize Value, was this idea of permissionlessness. So we've talked a little bit about this. So taking, and I don't want anybody to interpret this literally, because it will just result in, you going down the exact same path I went down. And that's like, the market has been flooded with that approach at this point. But taking somebody's work, taking an idea that you appreciate and building on it in some way to contribute to the bigger discourse, I think, is what this is really about. And until my mentality shifted from, I think that shares some of the same qualities as writing for, like, being selfish, write for yourself, because there is something selfish about generating the feeling you get when you help somebody. Does that make sense? Like, I definitely feel more, I definitely get more satisfaction from helping somebody understand something or build something than I do from writing something that I want to read. Like, that doesn't resonate with me in the same way as this person has, you know, I'll give a personal example. This person has a grandparent who has Alzheimer's, and they're working on this. They discovered some, like, supplement that helps their grandfather better recall information on a day-to-day basis, and they want to turn that into a product that the other people in that situation can access. But the hole in their skill set is branding, design, marketing, all of these things. If I can go in and sort of fill that void and occupy like, play a role in making that happen, that to me is way more satisfying than, yeah, I think it's approaching it problem first rather than the what you want to write about. And I think, it's a really complex, there's no, like, very succinct answer for it, but that to me is a more anti-fragile way to approach it, if that makes sense. It attracts, like, freelance opportunities. You can turn that into all sorts of opportunity in the meantime, and then eventually the pendulum swings where you've refined who you are to the point where you become a magnet, if that makes sense.
Jack, one more question. Can you talk a little bit about some of your inspirations? I think one person who comes to mind is Carl Richards. I can see a lot of Carl Richards thinking his aesthetic in your work, and you can see that things are pretty similar in terms of how you think. And so I'm curious to hear, where have you gotten a lot of inspiration, and how have you taken the inspiration of others as a launching pad that then have allowed you to tap into your own originality as a creator?
Yeah, so Carl Richards is now a friend of mine, and I must have seen his work at some point, and this is another example of, like, collecting dots subconsciously. Like, in if you asked me to name, like, designers that I admire, I would say, like, Dieter Rams, the Braun product guy, Joseph Muller Brockman, who's a Swiss graphic designer, and I must have seen Carl Richards' work somewhere, but I did not click until I think he reached out, and I was like, man, I've been ripping this guy off for years, and he didn't see it that way. But it's incredible how, like, it's literally an inverse aesthetic. He talks a lot about money and mental models, and even the subject matter is super similar, right? There are a few people out there that are using, like, diagrams to explain complex ideas, and I think it's partially that, and it's also it came about as partially a necessary thing to win business on the service side. So I was trying to win graphic design clients to do things like visualize these sales pitch decks for supply chain companies, but putting that in my portfolio and, like, putting that out on Instagram is not going to resonate in the same way that if you take a Marcus Aurelius quote and add some visual context to it. That sort of, you kill two birds with one stone in that instance. You demonstrate that you can visualize ideas. You can take an idea and add visual context to it, and you're sort of broadcasting your skill set to would-be clients. So it was half creative expression and half sort of soliciting for freelance work that originally created the visualized value template, as it were.
I want to share something. I have an idea called imitate then innovate. And I just want to share how comedians think about this, because I think there's a lot of similarities between what you can do as a writer, what you can do as a designer, and then what we've actually already seen from comedians. So check this out. But what happens if you can't copy perfectly? This was a big epiphany for me. And it's that the best thing about copying is that the failure to do so is a success in and out of itself. When you do a bad job copying somebody, you end up revealing your own voice. Take, for example, talk show comedians who have tried to copy their idols, failed, and then become great themselves. So Johnny Carson tried to copy Jack Benny, but failed and won 6 Emmy Awards. Then David Letterman tried to copy Johnny Carson, but failed and became one of America's great television hosts. In reflecting on his own influences, another comedian, Conan O'Brien, said, quote, "It is our failure to become our perceived ideal that ultimately defines us and makes us unique." See, all of these comedians learned that imitation reveals our identity, especially when we fall short of the people that we admire. So I think what's really interesting there is like you can actually tap into imitating other people. And often what ends up happening is you find these holes and sort of this resistance in your imitation, and then who you eventually become ends up revealing itself. And so it's really interesting to hear Jack say, I've collected all of these dots. Like, I bet if you were to squish all them together, they'd be like right next to how Jack is. But because there's so many of them, and because Jack has sort of had years of actually doing the work of processing the ideas, he ends up with something that's like deeply original, almost like when you mix all the different colors together and it ends up as white, and you're like, how in the world is that possible? I think that that's how imitation can then lead to originality.
Yeah, I have a idea that just struck me as I was watching that video of yours, where it's almost like you're staring at something on the horizon. So that might be somebody that you're wanting to emulate, or somebody that you admire and you wish your work was, recognized in the same way, or there's just something about that work that you love. So you want to follow that person in whether that's creating things or literally getting closer to where they are. And then you get to the horizon and you see other things. So your path is kind of veering with each iteration. So you get halfway there and then you see a different direction, or there's somebody else that you think, or some piece of work you see, or a book you read, or something that veers you off slightly. So you're in pursuit of this thing, but in that pursuit, you kind of get distracted along the way and just end up in a totally different place as a result.
Exactly. So speaking of imitation, I want to start my own presentation with an imitation of sort of what I'm picking up from Jack. I've taken a lot from just his own drawings, and it's been a blast for me to look at his drawings and then try to basically implement them myself. And so what I want to sort of talk about today is get going. You're like the little kid playing basketball, you get good. You're like Jordan going up for the slam dunk. And so the question is, how did I get going as a creator? This is where I want to begin. Jack was talking a little bit about how when he was getting going, he had nobody looking at his stuff. And for me, I was in university at the time. And what happened was I was doing some college television. And here's a clip from my sophomore year.
Welcome back to Elon News, Local News. I'm David Perell here with today's sports update. It was a busy weekend for Elon Sports. Let's begin with the football game. In their final meeting against conference rivals, a 1-2 Elon team was eager to beat App State for the first time since 1964.
Okay, why are my eyebrows moving like that? It makes no sense whatsoever. I start off, I have the little mistake at the beginning where I have to like re-rehearse it, and then when you do television at the end, there's this thing, it's called crosstalk. Listen to how awkward this crosstalk is.
Thanks, David. Now let's talk more about Elon football as a whole. 1-3. That's not the best start.
You know, it's not the best, but Coach Swepson insisted that the team was still good. They were on a right track, and he's proud of their improvement. They take on Coastal Carolina for a matinee game at 1:30. They'll all be home for dinner, and the parents will be out supporting the Phoenix this weekend.
Well, that sounds great.
I'm so embarrassed, but you know what? I'm absolutely humiliated, but you know what? It's funny, but that's what got me started. That's what I was like as a presenter, almost a decade ago now. And at the time, I was like, I got into college originally to play college golf. And so I tried to start this like golf instruction business called Top Performance Golf. This was our very first website. And I took this photo with this DSLR camera, which at the time was the biggest purchase I'd ever made. And, I was writing these blog posts that weren't very good. And I was just totally convinced that I was going to end up working in the golf industry. And we didn't end up going far with this business at all. And what then happened, though, was because I had begun marching down the path of saying, hey, I'm going to start a golf business, I ended up seeing the world differently. And I remember you've probably seen this before, it's this Disney flywheel. And so Walt Disney drew this, I think in 1957. And what this is it's basically how all of Disney as a business would work together. How the distribution would deal with the merchandise with television with music. He drew this whole thing out. And I was like, oh my God, that is the craziest thing I've ever seen. And so I drew one myself. This was more than half a decade ago. This was the original flywheel that I thought I would build. And what's pretty crazy is in some ways it stayed the same. In some ways it's totally different. Like you can see like this is all about the golf industry. And this is, what I was really focused on. Actually here, I guess it had evolved a little bit out of it. I was focused on media, sports, entertainment, travel, transportation. I guess I would monetize through product placement and sponsorships. This is what I was thinking at the time. And this was the thing. I was like, incorporate golf at the bottom. I just didn't know. And this book right here is Industries of the Future. I was really thinking about the future. But what's also wild is how similar that ended up being. And so I went from that flywheel. I wrote an academic paper in 2016 called Models of Internet Monetization. It was a published paper. And what's pretty crazy is that in some ways, things are totally different. In some ways, I've just been focused on this question of models of internet monetization for the last more than half a decade now. And what came from that is I'm still obsessed with that same question. And so it's interesting that both Jack and I worked in advertising agencies when we got started. And what happened was I joined, took this photo on my first day at an agency called Laundry Service. And what's really cool about working in an agency is you work with so many different clients that you actually end up getting that 10,000 iterations thing that Jack was talking about earlier, because you have stuff coming at you all the time and you're always needing to sort of change how you present your product, how you're thinking. You actually need to inhabit the mind of your client. And unfortunately, 7 months in, I found out that people were becoming media companies, and 7 months in, I was laid off. And that idea that people were becoming media companies was sort of the core thesis of the company. I was laid off, and I remember very vividly being with my boss and him giving me some feedback and saying, you know what, you're not a very good writer. This was one of the big pieces of feedback I got. And I said, I want to turn that around. So I remember he's 6'4", this tall guy, big beard, kind of like one of those sales guys who's pretty intimidating. And I was like, the short little kid out of college. And I remember looking back at him and saying, hey, Mike, how can I become a better writer? And I remember him saying, just write all the time and read the great writers and try to embody what it is that they do. Really try to soak up whatever it is that makes them excel. Didn't think much of it, but I didn't realize that ended up being the impetus for my drive. But being laid off was just brutal. And I went years without, I never reached out to my boss, but more on that later. And so what I did was I had no idea where I wanted to go. So I basically came up with this metaphor called the North Star. And the North Star is called Polaris, and it's quite bright, and it's, I think, 1 degree. I was talking to an astrophysicist last week. I think he said it was 1 degree off from true north. So old sailors, they used to look at the North Star as sort of how they would calibrate their direction. And I said, you know what? I have no idea what I want to do with my life. I'm going to start this thing called the North Star. So this was my first logo. It is horrendous. It is absolutely horrendous. The website was called northstar.store. Facebook was huge at the time. This was our just main logo. It's really flat. It's ugly. The blue just doesn't look good. Any normal designer would look at this thing and puke. I designed it in like Microsoft Word or something. And this was my tagline, which is literally the most generic thing ever. We help founders realize their vision and achieve their dreams. And I mean, I don't think that you could write a more corporate and generic tagline if you tried. And I remember Jack's presentation reminded me of this. I remember getting in arguments with my mom, literal arguments over if we should use we versus I. And my mom was like, we should use we to make you sound, bigger and more substantial. And I was like, but that's lying. Like, it's just me. And she's like, but no one's going to hire you if it's just you. All these sorts of things. And so I lied to the world and I said we. And my friends at the time, I was starting this. I was making these really cringe YouTube videos. And this was from a recent email from a college friend. And this is what he says. I can't tell you how many times some of the mutual people we know made fun of your efforts. They didn't have respect for what you were working on, nor the vision to see what you were working toward. And I knew that people were making fun of me. It was very hard emotionally to know that that was the case, but I kept on pushing through it. And one of the game changers for me was a piece called Naked Brands. It must have been the 20th article I published, and I couldn't believe it. Like, I couldn't sleep at night. I was so excited. 6,000 people read this article in a single day. And I was just like, oh my goodness. And the whole thesis of this article was that people were becoming companies. So I'd been at this agency. I'd learned that people were becoming media companies there. That was the thesis there. I said, you know what? Just strip out media. People are becoming companies. People like Jack, they are going to have their own companies. And, half a decade ago, I realized this. I turned it all into a piece and I said, wow, that's pretty interesting. I'm going to begin to harvest this idea. And at the time, though, I had to ask, how can I find work? Remember, I was laid off. They just, let me go. It was 6 p.m. on a Friday. I had 5 minutes to get out of the office. And I stormed out and I was like, I think I got 2 weeks severance. And which at the time I thought was the most generous thing ever. And I was like, I'm living in New York City. I need to find work. And so I started to look at the finance industry. And I had some ideas because I had kept writing. Writing was always the thing that, like, if I would writing is like research and development for your mind. It's like when you commit to writing for every single day, you're like a company that commits to having an R&D lab. Because when you write, you realize things, you begin to invent things that you would have never seen otherwise. And I wrote a piece called Naked Brands, the Future of Finance. So I took that original Naked Brands piece. I wrote one about commerce. I wrote one about basketball. I wrote one about finance. And from this finance one, I learned about Warren Buffett and Howard Marks. And both Buffett and Marks built their names by writing these annual letters. And what they would do is they would basically put their ideas on the page, and then other people could see their thinking. They could say, hey, Howard Marks, Warren Buffett, they're really smart. I like how they think. I want to give my money to them. And I said, you know what? Now that media, both the production and distribution of media has been democratized, there's going to be a huge opportunity for financial advisors to basically start writing on the internet and use Twitter to basically build their brands and grow their audiences. And this wasn't really me like predicting the future or anything like that. This was me just looking at what was happening and basically saying, this is actually going to be a way bigger part of the future. How can I capitalize on this? So what I did was, I remember my first ever client was this company called GBM. They're a bank in Mexico City, and they flew me down to Mexico to give this presentation. And I was like, I don't know. I felt like an absolute king sitting economy class on this flight in this dinky little hotel room. But you know what? I was like, I'm the man. I'm being flown abroad to talk about goals, personal background, market shifts, industry positioning, developing a content strategy, and a proposal. So they were all excited. I was like, we'll transform GBM's content arm, all these things. This was actually from the hotel I stayed at. This was a view. The president of Mexico lives just behind this flag to the right, and this is the big auditorium in Mexico City. And this was the presentation I gave. I flew literally to another country to talk to like 11 people, but I thought this was just the biggest deal. And turns out I didn't do a very good job. They never hired me back. And that was the end of that. So I was like, damn it, I didn't do a good job. I just don't have a good career here. So then I started pitching individual asset managers. So I did that. These were proposals. I talked about this naked brands workshop, all this stuff that I was just making up and, trying to say, hey, maybe this will work. And I ended up finally getting a client in Sydney, Australia. And his name was Paul. And I did one presentation with him. He was all happy about it. Second presentation, he's like, you know what? This isn't very good. And I realized that I didn't know how to communicate my ideas, and that my business model of actually trying to do these presentations, it just wasn't quite right. But you know what? I was getting going. I'll give myself that credit. I just hadn't figured out how to get good. And so what I realized was that the world rewards the people who are the best at communicating ideas and not necessarily the people with the best ideas. The world rewards people who are the best at communicating ideas and not necessarily the people with the best ideas. And so this then leads into rite of passage, which is really my whole professional life now. And this was the very first outline I made for the course. This was November 2018. And this was my original idea. The course is an introduction to personal branding. The internet has transformed careers, networking, and friendship. And through this course, you're going to learn how to use one of the most powerful tools in human history. If you know how to use it well, it's almost impossible to underestimate the impact the internet can have on your life. Internet fluency is the ultimate meta skill. Honestly, pretty good for a mission statement. I would give this a solid B, especially for a first try. But I was getting going, and you can see on the right, we need to hire a videographer, design the production set. And I was just trying to figure all this out. I hadn't even come up with some of the main principles in the course, like building a personal monopoly or anything like that. So what happened was me and the guy who helped me make the course, Tiago Forte, who's still my business partner, we went down to Mexico City and we hired these two videographers. So that's Tiago on the left. Here are the two videographers on the right. And then here's a shot from looking through the camera. And basically what we would do is we went to the Mexican Starbucks. It's called Tierra de Garat. It's a really nice coffee shop. And we went there every single day. We got this big pen and paper pad. And we basically just wrote out the curriculum, one new module every single day. It was brutal work. And you can see us here trying to make sense of everything. And what I was really trying to do here, and Jack, this might be a good place if you want to come in and talk about this, is I was trying to basically create a sculpture by just getting a bunch of marble on the page. So Michelangelo said, the sculpture is already complete within the marble block before I start my work. It's already there. I just have to chisel away the superfluous material. So what I needed was all the marble, and then later I could start chiseling, which is really what I've been doing for the past 2 years. We were looking for the statue inside of my mind. We knew it was there, but we need to start with marble and then eventually craft the statue. And I love this. This is, of everything Jack has made, this is my favorite representation of a similar idea. I mean, I absolutely love that. And Jack, I'm curious to hear what stands out about this for you.
So I was just, as you were explaining it, there were so many slides. I was like, man, I should have put this in, because there's a really great crossover between, you tweeted something. This must have been 2000. It must have been like May last year or something. And you said, I really want to learn design skills, and you tagged me, and I was like, just quote tweeted that tweet and said, who would be up for a design course based on the stuff that you see in Visualize Value? Great response. And I had a very similar transition to you. It was like a design course was where I started, which is similar to your, like, we're going to help founders achieve their dreams. And I was sat down to make the thing. I was like, where the hell do you even start with a design course, right? And I think you've accomplished this with with Rite of Passage, but it had to go way narrower. So it became how to visualize value. So you're like reverse engineering the process of this thing that people already understand what it is. And the block of stone was the tweet that went out. They're like, we're going to make an education product about design, and then refining it to the point where it becomes something specific to a very, particular strain of design was what needed to happen. But again, I think another interesting like get going situation. I work really well under these circumstances because of the agency background. It's like, I'm going to do this and it's going to be ready in a week. And it's like, then I just have to figure it out. I've announced it. People have paid me in some circumstances. So I collected like prepayment, and that there's nothing more motivating to me than like having, people's hard earned cash and having to deliver a return on that. So that for me is like, there's a great crossover there. I wish I'd have made a slide on that, but perhaps I'll write a little blog post or something.
Do it. So what both Jack and I did was we got going by creating marble. And what we found was that statues were like the statue of David. And Will, do you want to talk about the Hall of Prisoners? You tell the story better than I do.
Yeah, happy to. So if you ever go to Florence, Italy, the best piece of artwork you can see is Michelangelo's statue of David. You see it there. But most people don't know there's several statues in the hallway leading up to the statue of David that are unfinished, halfway out of the marble and halfway in. And when I saw this in person, I thought, what a perfect contrast, what a perfect metaphor. There's the statue of David. It's immaculate. Hard to believe a human being could create something so stunning, but contrasted with these half-finished statues still coming out of the marble. That excess marble are the worries, distractions, bad habits that hold us back. And to continue chiseling away and becoming closer to that perfect ideal vision of what you could be. I was really inspired when I saw that. And that's the end result if you can get there and just lose the excess through taking action. So that is the Hall of Prisoners story.
It's just a magnificent idea, because as you get good, what you realize is that then you can refine the details. And you can look at the statue of David from the distance that everybody sees it. But then once you actually begin to look at sculptures and you really begin to go in, I mean, look at the muscles on the neck. Look at how they bulge like that. The way that sort of the neck leads into the top of the chest, and just the detail, the way that the nose is constructed, the way the lips move. I mean, it's magnificent. But the thing is, you can't start here. You have to end here. And it was because those creators started with that block of marble, and like Will so magically said, went through the chiseling phase of ugliness. Only because of that could they create this beauty. And so you hear that, and then you see what Jack made one more time, and it comes alive with a totally different meaning. It's beautiful. And so this brings us back to that theme of get going, then get good. But how does this apply to writing? And one of the things that a lot of writers try to do is, you'll see, so I'm going to show you two sort of rows of images. And a lot of novice writers try to do the top bar. I recommend doing the bottom bar. And we have this principle in Rite of Passage called get your blurry thumbnail down. And here's what it means. What a lot of writers try to do is they try to basically, it's like the way that a printer prints a photo. They try to get every single line be perfect. Sentence 1, perfect. Sentence 2, perfect. Sentence 3, perfect. But if you're listening to what Jack and I are saying here, the way that our stories have gone, the way that good writing actually happens, the way that marble becomes statue is it actually starts off with everything in a way that's blurry, and then over time becomes clarified. And so with writing, what a lot of people try to do is, like I said, every single line perfect, when it's so much better generally to just get everything on paper, dump it down, And then once it's there, you can actually begin to craft and construct it, which is why a lot of people in Hollywood, they call their first draft just the vomit draft. Just get it on paper. What they're really talking about is that thumbnail on the bottom left, which is the blurry thumbnail. And so it's that block of marble, which you turn into a statue. And so I think that we can actually learn a lot from artists, and Get Going and Get Good is like a sketch. So one of my personal favorite artists is Edward Hopper. He painted all of these very serene photos or images of the American landscape. You'll see a lot of these, especially like that top one in the middle and then the one on the bottom right. These are his urban landscapes, and then he painted some rural ones too. And this is one of my favorite paintings of his. It's called Morning Sun. And you could look at this and you could say, wow, it's a magnificent painting. I mean, look at the way that light shines onto her legs. And this is one of the things that Hopper was very good at, dealing with light and shadow. But you look at something like this, and these were Hopper's original sketches. You can see he's just getting going. He's just putting, it's like that vomit draft, right? It is trying to just get the marble, to get the original image. You can see the different ways that the windows are rotated. You can see on the top, she is more to the right than she is in the middle. Hopper is just trying to make sense of, what am I going to do with this piece? And then Hopper begins to actually go in and focus on, okay, what is her head going to look like? What is the shape of her nose? How is the roundedness of the back of her head going to look? How's it going to interact with the hair? Then you can see one extra ear on the right. We're trying to now make sense of what this piece is going to be like. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're actually going to label all of the different parts of this painting, and we're going to say, this is what's going to be here, this is what's going to be there. We're actually watching Hopper as Hopper moves through the construction of this piece, going from Get Going in order to eventually getting good through sketches, and ends with this. And so it's so easy to look at Morning Sun and say, Hopper's just more talented than I am. But then you begin to look at the sketches, the refinement, the clarity, the focus, and you begin to realize that what Hopper's doing is just going through step by step. And so artists don't turn every sketch into a polished painting, because not every sketch is worthy of being a polished painting. But I think there's a question that we need to ask. When you're already going, how do you know when to get good? And so I call this the content triangle, where you get going by sharing ideas, you get good by refining your best ones. So I started one of my first articles, I think this was my third or fourth one, called It's Time to Disrupt Our Archaic Education System. I mean, the piece isn't very well written by any means. It's a throwaway piece that belongs in the trash can somewhere. But the actual idea, what I started with getting going with, I'm trying to get good at that every single day. And Will and Monica, who you see on the screen right now, they are a part of helping me get good at this challenge. Because the problems in education were clear to me, but the solutions were not. And you'll see this a lot in your journey, where there'll be certain issues, certain ideas that you realize, but then how to actually take action and create that vision, how to make it happen, it's not always obvious to you. And so now, from that article, this is our team. This is the team that runs Rite of Passage. And together, we're getting good at what I started with getting going with when I wrote that first article. And then there's Twitter, of course. I mean, these were some of my first tweets, and they're just atrocious. You don't want to use this many hashtags. It's just not a compelling tweet at all. It's just an image. It's like it adds no value to the reader of this tweet whatsoever. I mean, this one's even worse. This one didn't get a single like or a single retweet. I could watch this interview over and over and over again. Hashtag inspiring. I mean, dude, what are you doing? But you know what? I was getting going. And so what I did was I doubled down on what resonated. And as Jack says, you want to do less, but better. Well, it's from Dieter Rams, but as Jack shows here, rather than trying to do all of these things, once you're ready to get good, you just focus on a couple things and you then get good through that focus. And so I watched what people resonated with, and I followed this this idea called the content triangle. I'd start with conversation. I'd say, okay, what do people resonate with in conversation? I'd share it maybe on Twitter. Then I'd share it in my email newsletter. And then I'd finally distribute it. What I'm doing is I'm getting this constant filtering mechanism, this constant feedback to then improve my ideas. And so what I'll often do is, this is how a lot of my articles begin. It'll be like this little image where there'll be like, I have some ideas that are sort of really well figured out, and I'll like maybe have a little path or something, and I'll be like, okay, these things are good, this is really pretty, but I don't really know how I'm gonna fill in the rest of this. And so I have like that spark of get going epiphany. And then what I'll do is I say, okay, I have this one part, but I need to fill in the whole thing. And then I'll go from a tweet into an essay. And so I'll take this original image, this original idea, and I'll turn it into something like this, where I go from having the image to then really filling it out and trying to make something really beautiful, focused on every single part of the picture that actually comes alive to me as I write. And that's actually what happened to me with this essay, Lifting Alone. So I was talking to a friend, I published this week, and it's now, I think it has almost 500,000 impressions in 2 days. And the story of how this happened was I was talking to a friend 2 weeks ago. He was about to go to work out. I had this idea. He said, oh, that's pretty interesting. Then I just worked out the idea through conversation with my family. Last week, I was telling my dad about it, my mom about it, and they asked some questions and stuff. Then I was on the plane from San Francisco to Austin. I wrote it out in my newsletter. Then like a bunch of people responded to my newsletter, and they said, hey, you know what? This is pretty interesting. Some people actually shared it on Twitter. And after I saw people sharing it on Twitter, I was like, you know what? I'm going to polish it up, and I'm going to now turn it into a more polished essay. So I live my life in the way that this content triangle happens. And this content triangle is the systematization of get going, then get good. And that's how I get from these original ideas into these pretty images, these pretty ideas. And so writing from conversation is one of Rite of Passage's core ideas. And that's why the course is such a social experience. That's why my way of thinking about writing is, rather than like be alone in a room by yourself, no, like surround yourself with people, actually embrace intellectual conversation. And then in that process, you end up coming up with good ideas and having realizations that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so when you get going, progress can be slower than you want. So here is my actual Twitter growth. And you'll see, I started in 2017 with 200, ended with 500, 2,000, 10,000, 10,000, 30,000. And then what happened was I just popped in 2020 up to above 140,000. But you can see I started in like 2013, and I was basically asymptotic along the x-axis. I wasn't going anywhere. And then I began to figure it out. Oh, and then remember my original business model? Well, that ended up figuring itself out too. And so what can we learn from these principles? I think that there's three things: inspiration, perspiration, and observation. These are sort of the three elements of get going, then get good. And so inspiration is that the seeds are planted early. And so what this means is I had that original business model from Disney. I drew it like this. And that original business model, this is what I have now. Well, you know, when I first drew it, I didn't really have email. Now email is the nucleus of everything I do. And now with the writing school, between Tiago and myself, we'll do more than 3,000 students next year between Second Brain and Rite of Passage. And our cohorts now are about 350 new students, and then about 150 returning alums. We're doing almost 500 students in many of our cohorts. I never expected that. That was an emergent process of what happened. And becoming an investor, I've now invested in double-digit companies. I would have never expected that. And so while others see a straight line, you as the creator, you end up seeing the winding path. And I've tried to sort of share with you what that winding path looks like. Other people think, oh, you know what? David just had this idea. Then he started Rite of Passage. It was just that. And that's how it worked out. But the truth is, for years, I was really struggling as a writer. I was struggling as a creator. I was struggling to build a business. And so what actually happened was that reality for me was a lot more curved. And there were all these actuaries that were actually dead ends to nowhere. And writing is the same way. So when you write, in order to write well, what you actually want to do is show how arriving at an idea was much more of a process of meandering, and you want to balance the straightness and the meandering. So let me show you what I mean by that. Writing is harder than it looks because readers think that a writer just took a straight line from the genesis of an idea to its final form. But in reality, the writer has to go through all these dead ends in order to develop what eventually becomes the final piece. So this is why an idea is like a river. In order to go from the beginning to the end, you don't go in a straight line. You sort of journey all over the place. And also you end up at all these dead ends. And in order to find where you're going, you have to follow this compass of intuition. And I think that as a writer, you want to give some of that experience to your reader. You want them to feel what it was like to discover an idea in a way that's fun. And you want to give them a little bit of the scenic route. But if you meander all over the place, then you're not giving the reader the sense of urgency that is a part of all good writing. So what you want to do is you want to balance that sense of urgency, and you also want to balance that sort of scenic route. And I think that this is what it looks like, where you don't want to take people through every single actuary. You want writing to really just be this purple line. You want to basically go from point A to point B, but sometimes if it's just a straight line, it just sounds trite. You actually need to, this is what it means to wrap your ideas in story. This is what it means to wrap your ideas in humors. There's setups before the punchline. Because often if you just have the punchline, the joke isn't nearly as funny. And writing is similar. You actually want some of your meandering. And the second thing, from inspiration now into perspiration, where the obscurity that you face when you first start getting going, that is actually a good thing. Young ideas should be protected with obscurity. And I think that they actually need to be cocooned from the tyranny of judgment. When you first come up with an idea, it's very fragile, it's very precious. And if you have the criticism of a bunch of people who are coming at you, you don't actually have the emotional armor to deal with it when you're first starting. And you also need some intellectual safety to begin to find your way and experiment with who are you as a creator and who aren't you as a creator. And obscurity is the shelter that you need in order to do that. And there's a great line from Johnny Ive where when at Steve Jobs' funeral, he was speaking. And Johnny Ive was the director of design for Apple for many years and was one of Steve Jobs' very closest friends. And he says, I think that Steve Jobs, better than anyone, understood that while ideas ultimately can be so powerful, they begin as fragile, barely formed thoughts, so easily squished. And what Jobs and what Johnny Ive understood was that at the beginning, ideas were like these eggs. They needed to be protected by this sort of gate, almost like a bird. And you need to protect these young ideas because they're so fragile. And then little ideas, they still need to be protected. They're just small. And only with time and attention and care and shelter and safety can they begin to fly. And as they fly, they get bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually they've grown up, and now you can see the entire journey from the fragile protection of eggs into the soaring bird. And this is what obscurity gives you. You know, a lot of people fight that obscurity. Why is nobody reading my stuff? Why do I post stuff and I hear nothing but the crickets of indifference? What is going on here? I'm so angry, I'm so mad, when in fact, this is often what you need in order to find who you are as a creative, because your original work isn't that good. And I'm going to get to that in a second. You need space to find your voice. And obscurity helps you fight through the taste gap. This is an idea from Ira Glass. It is one of the very most important things that I think every creator needs to hear. This video is about 1.5 minutes long, but it's absolutely excellent. And I think it speaks better than anything I've ever seen to the benefits of obscurity.
Nobody tells people who are beginners, and I really wish somebody had told this to me, is that all of us who do creative work, like, you know, we get into it, and we get into it because we have good taste. But it's like there's a gap that for the first couple years that you're making stuff, what you're making isn't so good, okay? It's not that great. It's trying to be good. It has ambition to be good, but it's not quite that good. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, your taste is still killer. And your taste is good enough that you can tell that what you're making is kind of a disappointment to you. You know what I mean? A lot of people never get past that phase. A lot of people at that point, they quit. And the thing I would just like say to you with all my heart is that most everybody I know who does interesting creative work, they went through a phase of years where they had really good taste, they could tell what they were making wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. They knew it felt short. It didn't have this special thing that we wanted it to have. And the thing I would say to you is everybody goes through that. And for you to go through it, if you're going through it right now, if you're just getting out of that phase, you got to know it's totally normal. And the most important possible thing you could do is do a lot of work. Do a huge volume of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week or every month you know you're going to finish one story. Because it's only by actually going through a volume of work that you're actually going to catch up and close that gap. And the work you're making will be as good as your ambitions. In my case, like I took longer to figure out how to do this than anybody I've ever met. It takes a while. It's going to take you a while. It's normal to take a while, and you just have to fight your way through that. Okay?
I mean, I love that. I think that is, Ira Glass is one of the most successful podcasters in the world. He hosts This American Life. And this is what you see, is that when you start, there's this gap between quality and taste. And your taste goes up slowly, and then your quality, you finally begin to figure it out. And it's almost asymptotic towards that taste. You never quite get there, but you get closer and closer as you get good. And this gap, this frustration, this is what we all feel when we start. And as creators, we need to know that, like, we, as Ira Glass says, we got into the game because we had good taste, but Jack and I were both tweeting stuff that was absolute garbage when we started, and we still kept on fighting through it. We still went through that get-going phase. I mean, Mr. Eyebrows over here with that original Elon Local News clip, I mean, it's humiliating. It's no good. And it's about keep going so that you can get those iterations. And then finally, observation. As Jack says, make noise and listen for signals. So this is about actually listening to the world. What is it telling you? The great American writer, 50 Cent, once said, the audience is always right. When people don't respond to what you do, they're telling you something loud and clear. You're just not listening. And I think that this is the final point that I want to make here, that it's not just about banging your head against the wall and just doing a bunch of iterations. It's about the iteration and the listening, the call and the response, actually listening to what people are saying, what they're telling you. And it's okay to have all of these X's. It's okay to have failure after failure. But eventually, if you get to a point where you're making noise and you're listening for a signal, you end up having that success. And you end up finding that checkbox, which then you can double down on. For me, that was writing. For Jack, that was design. And speaking of checkboxes, a couple cool things to share. Last week, the guy who ended up laying me off at laundry service reached out to me with just an incredible note. Hey, buddy, just a quick note to say, I'm so happy for all the success you've had. You should be extremely proud of yourself. And sometimes it just takes years. Sometimes it takes years to get to a place where some of the people who were hard on you at the beginning, the people who gave you the inspiration, end up having the validation for you at the end. For me, this was more than half a decade. And next time I'm in New York, we're going to get together, which I'm just really excited for. And then also remember that college friend from the beginning, the guy who said that everyone was mocking me. I mean, he reached out to me too and just said really nice things like, you are proof that pushing boundaries and exploring unconventional paths can be rewarding with enough perseverance. And you now know the principle here. Jack and I have opened it up for you in total, which is get going, then get good. So before we go into the Q&A, if you liked this fast-paced style of presentation, the next rite of passage opens up on September 8th and enrollment opens on August 23rd. And this is what it's like. Hundreds of people who are just obsessed with the craft of creating online, becoming better writers, becoming citizens of the internet. And it is just a place where you're going to find a level of obsession and a level of dedication that you won't find many other places on the internet, and especially when it comes to people who want to build their audiences and explore all the nuances with the craft of online writing.
All right, Dave, do you want to jump into some Q&A? What are you feeling?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do a Q&A until the bottom of the hour.
So have a handful of questions here. Please keep adding questions to the chat as well. Most common question, we got this several different varieties, but basically it's where to get started, right? You're talking about all these things, get going, then to get good, but people have different interests, several things like writing, designing, coding. How do you know where to start? That's people's biggest challenge, it seems.
Well, I'll give advice based on my personal experience. So I think the idea of you can either do this you can seek permission to do this, or you can do it without permission. And I think it depends on the level of experience you have already. So I think in the case of design, for me, I was in environments with mentors who like put problems in front of me based on 3 years of design school. And I think there's definitely a strong narrative around, you don't need a degree to succeed in an internet economy. And while that is true, I think this idea of developing a skill in a community of some sort is powerful. So, yeah, I think places like Visualize Value, Write a Passage. If you're not going to go and spend, I'm going to shill our own stuff here, talking the book, but the idea of building a skill set in complete solitude without support is really difficult. And unless you have I haven't heard that idea of David's with the, what did you call it, Dave, with the egg and the
Fragile ideas and stuff.
Yeah, the ability to share fragile ideas and community. And there are definitely places on the internet you can go and find that. There are still places you can go and do that in person. And I think there is, maybe we've over-indexed in some respects on how long you should spend doing that before you expect to get a return on your effort and energy. But I think the advice would depend on where you are in the journey. If you're at a stage where you can produce something that solves someone's problem, then I've spent a lot of time thinking about this idea of permissionless apprenticeships. So I'd say just go out and build things, post things, solve people's problems. If you're at the beginning of the experience curve, then find a community that you can develop a skill alongside, and then you'll go out into the world and figure out ways to apply that in new and interesting ways.
Yeah, I would say just broadly, rite of passage is a 5-week answer to this question. So I've spent years thinking about how do I wish I would have started. But I think that if you don't feel ready to purchase something to help you, I would say find a group of people who can hold you accountable for writing consistently or for creating consistently in whatever it is that you do, and make sure that you're publishing in public and not just hoarding the ideas for yourself, because for 2 reasons. The first is, remember principle number 3, observation. Listen for signal. If you don't publish in public, you won't have a sense for what resonates with people, and you won't know what you want to double down on. You'll actually find, once you create online, that your intuition for what is really going to hit is actually surprisingly bad. So you'll publish a bunch of ideas, and it's actually very hard to predict what's going to pop. And you want to double down on those things. So that can only come if you are publishing in public. And the second benefit of being public with your ideas is it's like inviting people to your house. You notice how whenever guests are coming over to your house, you're always about 10 to 20% tidier. The same thing happens with creative work. Once you publish ideas and you share them with other people, the quality of your work improves because you know that others are going to see it. So I would say find an accountability group, write in public, and if you can do those two things, then you'll be on your way to getting good.
Interesting question here. How much is too much tweeting? Once a day, once a week? And I think there's maybe a question behind the question there about, what people are thinking about you when you're starting creating, and how many iterations you should be thinking about early on in this process. So love to hear your all's thoughts on that.
I have an idea or a model around this that's specific to me. So the volume of tweets that I sent increased after I had sort of put in the work to build assets that those tweets helped grow. So once I developed a couple curriculums and like thought through ideas in depth, the Twitter as a vehicle became like the main way to direct attention to those curriculums. But I think if that effort didn't flip in the first place, then those tweets don't have the depth to, it's kind of this barbell strategy, right? You have these very deep developed assets in the same way that, Rite of Passage functions as a asset and the essays on David's blog function as an asset. And those tweets are almost like front doors to those other assets. So I think there's I would think about it as the front cover of a book or an essay or things of that nature. So loose rule of thumb, like tweeting 30 times a day, if you're not also, writing an essay a day or iterating on a product that you've built, feels too much on the flighty side of things versus, maybe you do 3 hours of deep work, which for me personally, the best condensed material comes from that process of getting your head stuck into something for a couple of hours. And then maybe a line comes out of that summarizes the idea, and you can, direct people's attention to this other asset. So, there's not a very specific answer to the question. I think it's very dependent on the situation, and there's definitely benefit to switching between those two modes of like very succinct summarizations of how you think. And a lot of that you will tweet more compelling thoughts if you've gone through that process of writing out your ideas in full too. So there's a relationship between those two things, if the TLDR of that very long-winded answer.
Makes sense. Another question about the early on days of becoming a creator, just ways that you all got feedback, where they're just go-to people, family, friends, if you don't have a big audience, but you want to do iterations, like strategies for getting feedback for people who are just starting out.
Yeah, I would say that there's really two strategies, and they actually are in synthesis. So the first is people that you know, and the second is people that you don't know who follow you. So with people that you know, these are going to be people in your close circle. And I found that a lot of people actually don't have a lot of people who they can share ideas with. And if you feel that sort of intellectual loneliness where you're like I get home and I am so excited about ideas when I'm reading stuff. I go on YouTube, I watch these amazing lectures, and then I hang out with my friends on Saturday afternoon, and they just are like, why are you talking about this? Why are you talking about this? We aren't interested in this. I felt that for a long time. It was pretty brutal. And if that's something you feel, it's kind of this, it's like a lion in a zoo. A lion wants to run and the cage won't let it. And if that's the case, I strongly then recommend that you're publishing stuff online, because once you do, you become a lighthouse for like-minded people, and you end up attracting the very people who end up giving you feedback. So they then come in synthesis, because the people who you attract when you publish stuff online end up becoming your friends, who then you can reach out to directly. But also, Remember, feedback doesn't need to be deliberate. Feedback is how many likes you get on a tweet. Feedback is how many responses or the quality of the responses you get from an email. Feedback is how people engage with an Instagram post. Feedback does not need to be as explicit as, hey, Sarah, can you please reserve the next 2 hours to edit my piece and give me feedback? And once you can actually just look at how people are engaging and responding to what you're saying, then you can think differently about feedback. Oh, and one more thing, feedback also comes through conversation by watching the facial expressions of the people that you're talking to. So if you're having a conversation at dinner and they're leaning in, they're interested in what you're saying. When people laugh, they're surprised. Those are good emotions. If someone's slouching and they fall asleep, well, my friend, they're bored about what you're saying. And so you can actually take feedback in all these ways, and you don't need to be so explicit about it. The world is always giving you feedback. Feedback is body language. Feedback is all over the place. You just need to start looking.
Let's end on this. This was a question very early on, Jack, during your part of the presentation. You were talking about being at the marketing firm, the design firm rather, and then you started publishing your work. Was there a single tipping point or single moment where you decided to make that leap into building in public? And if so, I would love to hear you share that.
I had my own advertising agency to begin with. I had no focus whatsoever. So just publishing in the same way that dribble page I showed was just like a random collection of project work. I was doing that originally with a Facebook page on Facebook, obviously, and just publishing screenshots of work, and couldn't really figure out why this wasn't resonating. And one of the ideas that I've been thinking about for a while is, retroactively, I've realized that if you can pioneer a format of some kind, so this is getting into the weeds a little bit, it really clicked for me maybe 2 days after I started tweeting from the Visualize Value handle on Twitter, which was a means to an end. Like, I was running that podcast agency that I mentioned before, and this was like client to try and solicit clients, and I was like, oh, who would be a dream client? And that's where it clicked. So I was like, I think Naval, Nassim Taleb, Seth Godin, all of these people whose books I'd read that are just like massively informed and shaped my thinking. I was like, if I imagine that these guys already signed a deal with me, right? Like, they're already paying me. I work for them. I create content for these guys. I just started posting it to Twitter, tagging them. And then that's the realization, I think. But then when I doubled down on the behavior was when I think it was an Nassim Taleb retweet. This is like the day after I started the Visualize Value Twitter account, and the notifications tab was just going like ding, 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 ding. And it was almost like I felt a little bit sick and overwhelmed by it. I was like, this is freaking bizarre. Because obviously you do get the other side of Twitter, and especially from a account like that has very like polarizing views and people following it that believe very specific things. There was some like complete pushback, like, this is nonsensical, or this is whatever. I can't even remember the exact response to it. But that was the moment in time. And I think, everybody will experience that at some point if you work on the internet, where the outcome so far outweighs the input that you're like, okay, this only needs to happen to me 2 or 3 more times, and I'll at least have enough people that I could work for one-on-one, right? It's just this absolute, like, complete reorganization of opportunity in your mind, especially if you have a really specific focus. So if there's a topic that you write about, or there's a style of design that you do that is, there's more demand than you can meet, then you're essentially, economically anti-fragile. And there's, like, we could go into a lot of detail about specificity, but I don't think that's helpful if you're beginning your journey either. That's where you end up.
All right, so you just watched 90 minutes of presentations. You want to improve your writing. What should you do now? 2 things. The first is I have a 50 days of writing email series where you're going to get 50 articles in 50 days for free. And all you do is enter your email, and I'm going to talk about how to get started with writing, how to improve your writing, and how to build an audience. And you'll see the sign up link in the show notes right here on YouTube. The second thing, if you're really serious about improving your writing, leveling up your craft, I do have Rite of Passage, and the whole course is designed to help you get going, then get good. And I think that there's two differences between Rite of Passage and a normal writing class. The first is that Rite of Passage is social, and the second is that it's dynamic. Nope, there's three of them. The third is that it's built for the internet age. So what I mean by social is this. A lot of writing classes, you're kind of not allowed to talk. You're sort of discouraged from it. Rite of Passage is the opposite. You're going to make a ton of friends. And by writing from conversation, that is what's going to help you, remember, work up the content triangle and improve your writing. The second is that Rite of Passage is dynamic rather than static. A lot of the writing courses I took, it was just some teacher at the front lecturing the entire time. I didn't want that. I wanted to create a course that was vibrant, high energy, teacher filled with enthusiasm. I love this craft. People who were psyched, fired up to be there, and where you were switching things up, changing things up all the time so that class felt fun and intense, but in a good way. And then the third is that Rite of Passage is built for the way the world is, not the way the world used to be. The internet changed the way that we consume, process, and share information, and Rite of Passage is a course that's built around the way the world is now. And it's not about just writing as an end in itself. It's about writing so that you can meet better people who you can riff on ideas with. It's about writing so that you can accelerate your career, make more money, do more meaningful work. And it's about writing so that you can think better, become a leader in the groups and organizations that you take part in, and also make better decisions in your life. So hope to see you in Rite of Passage, maybe seeing you reading 50 Days of Writing, but no matter what, thanks for joining me.